Ian Williams joins me now from New York. He's the author of a number of books, including The United Nations for Beginners. Ian, welcome to the program. Now, 70 years ago, the conditions were much different than they are today. So how relevant is the UN in the 21st century?
Well, it's completely relevant. But the real answer is, just as in 1945, 46, it's as relevant as the great powers want it to be. And they have found it essential. The UN provides a ladder for them to climb down when they've run up a tree and they can't think of any other way. So you'll find that they ignore it, and then suddenly they decide that they have to have it. You know, in Syria, they've had the UN involved all along. But in the end, the UN can't do anything in Syria or anywhere else without both the great powers and the other regional powers getting involved. So it really is a balancing act. But the question is, the Secretary General and the UN do have immense moral authority. If they speak out, which they don't do often enough, they can really name and shame countries.
So you have the great powers, regional powers, and the Secretary General. This is quite confusing. Now, one thing that hasn't changed in the organization's history is the fact that it faces a number of challenges. What are some of today's challenges?
Well, your previous speaker went through them. Syria is the big one. There are others. The question of peacekeeping, how do you deal with it? Even the question that the UN doesn't control the forces that operate under its name. It borrows them from countries. So it can't discipline rapists in Central Africa who are in the peacekeeping forces. It has to rely upon the countries concerned to do that. It has to rely upon the consent of countries like the US to provide logistics for major operations. It has to rely upon countries like the US and China to provide money as well, which they don't always do. Although you notice that's actually not the issue that it was 10 years ago. The UN does seem to be securely funded mostly and is not living hand to mouth. But in the end, it's legitimizing authority that really counts. The UN, without the UN, we wouldn't have a non-proliferation treaty. Although that looks a bit odd with the North Korean situation. The fact that North Korea is an anomaly. Without that non-proliferation treaty and the test ban treaty, we probably have 20 or 30 nuclear powers now. The UN has got achievements, but they're often that sort of negative achievement, so it doesn't jump up and down in public attention. The fact that Argentina and Brazil and Egypt and others don't have nuclear weapons is sort of negative, but highly significant and something to be praised, I'd have thought.
Okay, now you're currently writing a new addition to your book. So tell us, what role will the UN play as an international body going forward? Does it still have influence? Does it need reform?
It certainly needs reform, but the problem is the price for reform is very high. If you think to change the League of Nations into the United Nations, we needed World War II. And I'm not really sure we're ready for World War III to significantly change it. And the Security Council, yes, it needs reform, but most of the reforms that have been proposed are worse than the original. They don't make it more effective. They're job creation schemes for diplomats and sort of ego prizes for aspiring great powers. The real issue is persuading the people who have the veto now not to use it in conditions like in Syria and, for example, in the Balkans previously, where it's stopped effective action.
Okay. Ian Williams joining us live from New York. We thank you for that analysis.